and welcome to the new episode of EBEA Consulting podcast with Sam Goldsworthy, Operations Planning Manager at Bristol Airport in the United Kingdom. His role is to provide customer-facing departments and key stakeholders with the information they require to provide the correct level of resources to meet customer demand and deliver a program of continuous improvement across all areas of customer operations to ensure a high level of customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. Hello Sam, and welcome to EBEA Consulting podcast. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome, and hello.
Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your career, how it developed, and how did it happen that you ended up in the aviation industry?
Yeah, I started at Bristol Airport back in June 2002, and I was a customer service coordinator in the terminal. My main job was just going around checking on queues, monitoring how business partners were performing, checking retailers and caterers. I progressed from that position to airport duty manager, so running the terminal as a whole, until 2006, where I then moved to the ops support department in the airport. And it was a brand new role, so there wasn't much of a scope at the time. They just felt they had a need for a new role. So my main responsibilities then was looking after some of the forecasting for the airport and looking after some of the soft services at the airport. So I was in charge of the cleaning contract and the waste contract. And then I basically developed that role and took on more and more of the passenger forecasting, and then we took STAM planning in-house. So I was responsible for bringing resource management into the airport team. Prior to that, it was done by one of the ground handlers. So my role was to train all our control centre staff who were going to be doing the resource management allocation in how to plan the stands, the gates, the check-in desks and the baggage belts. Mm-hmm. And from that point onwards, I was getting more and more involved with sort of passenger forecasting. I did all the security figures, all the passenger flows to go out to business partners and internal departments. And that role became sort of more and more involved until a couple of years ago it was decided to split off the soft sort of services facility side of the work I did so that I could concentrate on the operational planning side of things, and then beginning to look at continuous improvement as well across the board. So that's kind of my main role now. So for the last few years, I've been focusing on what areas that we can look at making sort of efficiencies and improve the experience for customers and also for staff.
Mm-hmm. That's all good stuff, and we know best how interesting, even though a very challenging of a role it is. Can you tell us a little bit more in depth on what your current role entails and how it is being conducted at Bristol Airport?
Yeah, so as the operations planning manager, we obviously still operate in a two-season format. So we have the winter and the summer season. So I'll look at the sort of the strategic plans for each season and then also look at longer term forecasting. So prior to each season, I'll produce a pack that will have the stand planning, the check-in desk planning, baggage belt plans. I'll also do the security forecast, and we do this sort of in 15-minute periods for every single day of the year. So I'll produce that ahead of the season for the sort of busiest week of each month. Mm-hmm. And then as we go throughout the season, I'll then produce day by day, hour by hour, expected PAX flows at security. That then goes to our security contractor, which is ICTS, who will then develop that into a sort of a lane plan as to when they'll open and close lanes and rostering. Mm-hmm. I'll provide PAX forecasts sort of on a day by day, hour by hour, split between departures and arrivals, to show the business partners when they need to open, when their peak hours will be. That helps them with all their rostering. And then as we go through the season, we also monitor the performance as we go along. So we'll look at security lane throughputs. We'll check the forecast versus when passengers actually arrived. We'll keep a track on trays per passengers, reject rates to make sure that we're as efficient as possible. Through security, we'll track performance at check-in on the self-service kiosks, obviously looking at queue times, but also looking at the throughputs through the kiosks and the performance on the baggage belts. And then the sort of stand planning and resource allocations, the check-in desks and the gates, that's done daily by the RMS team. So I'll send out the busiest week plan to our control center staff, which they use as the basis, but they have to do dynamic planning around the operation because it's obviously it can change quite rapidly.
It is dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah. So a plan made 3 months beforehand is barely worth the paper it's written on. I'm more looking to see that we've got enough stands where we'll have pinch points, where our gates might become tight, and what we can do to try and mitigate those times when we're really pushed for resources. So the daily planning is just done by control center around the operation to make the best fit possible. And then we sort of report monthly to our shareholders and across the airport on what our performance has been. So we'll look at contact stand usage, on-time performance, queue times, passenger numbers against the budget and the forecast, and report on all of that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I think that it may not necessarily be so obvious for some other regions of the world, but I think, like in case of security, for example, it's really interesting to see how different the summer season could be from the winter season, for example, let's say in terms of the number of trays per passenger and how that affects security throughputs and performance in general.
Yeah, so what we see in a peak summer season is around about 1.5 trays per passenger currently. So back in 2019, when we were doing close to 1 million passengers a month, we had all 12 of our lanes in use. So we've got 10 main central search lanes and we've got 2 fast track lanes. So on a peak sort of Friday morning first wave, we'll have close to 30 aircraft departing within a short 1.5 hour period. So for that intense sort of 4 in the morning through till 7 o'clock, we'll need every single security resource open, even at 1.5 trays per passenger. And then because we're very based heavy, so we'll have 30 aircraft go out first wave, we'll then see secondary peaks at lunchtime and then again at tea time and early evening as the aircraft come back. So you'll see 3 main peaks throughout the day. So we'll sort of be up to nearly full X-ray in use in the morning. So 12 out of the 12, and then come lunchtime, it's slightly less than that. So you'll see 8 or 9 X-rays in use. But in between that, you might only need 2 or 3 in use. In the winter, it's even more dependent on the day. So what we'll see is at the weekend where we have a ski program, you'll be close to summer because our trays per passenger, because of the colder weather where they're flying to, it can go well above 2. This year we've seen 2.3 trays per passenger, which means in effect that you almost need as many X-rays as the summer for those peak departure periods when you're very heavy on particularly ski destinations. But then outside of that time, you're then down to much fewer X-rays, so 1 or 2, because the passenger does drop off. So yes, the trays has quite a big impact on where the number of resources you need, but you kind of see the same level of tray throughput. You're just seeing fewer passengers in the winter. They're generating as many trays as they do in the summer, really, at peak.
Correct. And we have already started touching on some specifics of the operation, which takes us to the first main topic that we will be discussing, and that is Bristol Airport operations, and also, difficult not to mention it, the COVID-19 as a turning point in aviation. So Can you please give us a brief introduction to Bristol Airport and its infrastructure?
So Bristol Airport, we did just over 9 million passengers in 2019. So we operate through one terminal with 48 check-in desks. We have 4 main airlines currently, 2 EasyJet and Ryanair. Jet2 are going to be coming on board in the spring this year. So we operate self-service kiosks on the EasyJet, Ryanair and TUI product, and Jet2 will bring their self-service kiosks in. And then we have some full schedule operators, KLM, SN, Brussels, operated in 2019, and we were hopeful that Lufthansa would start in 2020. That was pushed back due to the pandemic. So they're sort of our main based operators. And then in between that, we have a few non-based full schedules. So we have Stober Air operating on behalf of Aer Lingus, Blue Island and Aurigny flying to the Channel Islands, and then a host of other ad hoc charter operations throughout the summer. We have 12, as I've already said, we've had 12 lanes at security, 10 main central search lanes and 2 fast track lanes. We then have about 30, it depends on the configuration, but around about 34 stands. Of that, 13 are contact stands, but we don't have air bridges, so they'll walk out to the stands from gates. So the remaining 21 stands are coached stands. And we have 20 boarding gates across the airport. So what we're doing first wave is we're having to double up on the boarding gates. So after we've managed to walk passengers out to one stand, we'll then coach from that gate, either before that operates or after that one operates.
Thank you very much. And back in the summer last year, summer 2020, we worked together on trying to assess the short-term impacts of physical distancing and the pandemic for the Bristol August operations. But then we also used Bristol infrastructure to build a simulation model that helped us for our research in general impacts of physical distancing measures on terminal operations and how any given area would impact the other one in terms of its operations. So all the infrastructure that you now described, if you are listening to it, you can actually visit our website and see, when you read about this research, you will have some photos from the simulation, or just check Bristol Airports as well. But can you please tell us what has been done ever since? So in terms of how you got impacted and the Bristol operations, what's been done since we started to observe the restart and the pickup in passenger demand, what is going on right now, and what are the plans for the coming months or the coming summer season?
Yeah, so the challenge we had when we knew that operations were going to resume in August is to implement the social distancing measures into the terminal, which we could do quite easily in terms of putting in 2 meter, at the time it was, separation in the queues, putting perspex in between all the self-service kiosks all around the security lanes, and on the check-in desks and boarding gates. The issue then became, at what point would that break? Because obviously we never designed the terminal with 2 meter distancing between passengers in mind. So we knew it would have a substantial impact on our sort of capacity, particularly if we're at a substantial first wave peak. But the question then was, at what point does it almost break in effect? And that's where the work with EBEA was really useful, because we could look at the different social distancing, what the predicted operation was going to be, and then at what point, if you had to lose, say, check-in desk because you could not put perspex on it, if you were reducing the number of points in operation, so you're putting a bigger gap between x-rays in order to maintain really good social distancing. It was at that point that we could then determine where you would have your pinch points. And in actual fact, what we saw with the work with EBEA was that we were okay in nearly every area, bar probably one. I think it was the TUI check-in was the one that highlighted that we would have to have all the self-service kiosks in operation and the manual desks in order to get through that. The added complexity was the PLF checks at immigration, the passenger locator form checks in immigration added additional time into the sort of processing time. And then as we saw countries introduce testing requirements and more recently pre-COVID tests, they need a negative test 72 hours before they leave Bristol. That adds, again, further processing time on to check-in, because the ground handlers have to check the QR codes against the bookings to make sure that they've got the right tests. And some countries are levying fines if people have not got those in place on their arrival. So it's adding even more sort of complexity into what was already a very, it had to be very efficient process in order to get the passengers through. So at the moment, we're kind of in a sort of hiatus period where we're waiting to see what the countries introduce in terms of which countries will require pre-COVID 72-hour fit-to-fly tests. The best example I have of that is what happened with the Amsterdam flights. So we had a daily KLM Amsterdam flights, and then come January, they introduced not only a 72-hour PCR test as a requirement, but then they also wanted a rapid antigen test 3 hours before departure. And that then puts a whole new complexion onto your sort of departure operation. So we have got a solution now in place, ready for when demand picks up for the 72-hour PCR, and then we probably will be able to introduce a rapid antigen test on site, but on a limited basis. At the minute, it's all going to depend on what the countries need. So we're really just waiting to see what decisions are made, and then obviously we're pending the government's decision on quarantine on arrival into the UK in a hotel as well. So that will add another complexity into the arrivals process, in addition to the passenger locator form checks that already have to be carried out.
With the testing, it's a really tricky situation at the moment, because what you already mentioned, you need to have the testing capability for the passengers, but also, as if it was not enough to set up this sort of facility on site, then you also have the whole magnitude of different requirements varying between the countries as well. So, being able to offer what is required depending on the destination, it's only adding on the complexity for the operations. But I think also it can be discouraging for the passengers. So where we want to build up passenger confidence towards air travel again, the ever-changing regulation and the lack of consistency, it seems to be undermining exactly what we need to lift off again.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. In an ideal world, every country would employ exactly the same standards, so therefore passengers know what they have to do. But the bottom line is, at the minute, we want passengers to fly when it is safe for them to do so. So we'll do everything we possibly can to put the measures in place that will help them do it. The last thing they want to be doing, having booked a flight, is then having to chase around to find a facility to do a PCR test. And we're absolutely 100% certain that we don't want any testing we do to impact on the testing that the NHS are doing as well, because that's obviously incredibly important at the minute. So we want to find a solution that will help our passengers, not impact on the wider NHS testing, but allow passengers to fly when it's safe to do so. Now, it's relatively simpler when you're looking at low volumes of flights. So the concern is if these measures stay in place and more flights start to operate. So if you go back to the 2019 levels of flying, you're suddenly talking nearly 1 million passengers a month. So 500,000 of those will be travelling out, will require to use our facilities with social distancing in place and pre-testing. That's a big, completely different kettle of fish to when you're seeing the sort of volumes we are at the minute, where in December, we had 50,000 passengers flying through the airport, so 25,000 flying out. So the ramp up in operations will bring with it a whole new set of challenges. And the biggest problem at the minute is the uncertainty about when or if that will happen this summer.
Exactly that. Thank you all for listening to the first part of our today's conversation. We hope to see you next week when we continue our discussion and talk about impacts of skill fade on airport staff and how it affects daily operations, to then focus on passenger experience and digitalization.